I wanted to introduce our speaker today. Brian Rhinehart is a professional genealogist and speaker and is the owner of CivilWarRecords.com. He is a graduate of Boston University's Certificate of Genealogy Research and the Genealogical Institute on Federal Records, GenFed, in Washington, D.C. A direct descendant of 6 Civil War soldiers, Brian specializes in research and record retrieval for Civil War and War of 1812 soldiers at the National Archives in Washington, D.C., and has retrieved military files for hundreds of clients there. So without further ado, Brian, if you'd like to unmute and share your screen.
Sure, I'm here. Thank you, Allison. Let me get my screen set up. There we go. And I like to look official and get a little laser pointer going on. So there we go. All right. Hey, so Allison, thanks for having me out tonight. I'm excited to be here. I'm looking at I was looking at the participants as you were introducing me, and I definitely recognize some of your names. So I'm glad some of you joined us here. Lots of new names and new faces though. So looking forward to talking about Civil War records with you guys. If you didn't catch what Allison said, I'm offering a door prize at the end of the presentation after the Q&A time. There is a link that has been put in the chat, and if you look, it'll probably show up again here in a second. And if you click on the link, just put your name and email address in there. That's a link to my website. That's not affiliated with the library. That's my website. If you put your name and email address in there, at the end of the presentation, I'm going to pick one person to get a Civil War pension file from the National Archives for free. So, all right. So while you guys are doing that, I'm going to start the presentation. And well, actually, before I do that, I want to point out this is actually a virtual background. I am not really sitting in this building. And if you don't know what this building is, this actually is the National Archives research room. I was actually in this room in that back corner right there a couple hours ago. And I left a little early to come to this presentation. But if you ever do research at the National Archives, this is the room that you would sit in. And that's Pennsylvania Avenue out that window right there. So you've probably heard of that one at least. So if you can see, I've titled this presentation, I Have a Civil War Ancestor, Now What? And it's kind of based on a true story. And I say that because when I first started doing my genealogy research, I would run across these cards on Ancestry that looked like this. And this is Henry Rhinehart, my 3rd great grandfather. I saw that and it was labeled something to do with the Civil War. I knew that his wife was Mary. I knew that he was from Ohio. Like, okay, that's kind of cool. I don't really know what I'm looking at, but that's pretty cool. So I would just kind of filed away and kind of forgot about it. I would also see cards like this, that these long rectangular cards attached to some of the like ancestry family trees. And again, I was like, well, that's kind of cool. I don't really quite understand what that is, but has to do with my ancestors, so I'm going to save it, and I'm going to say that it's a Civil War file, but in all honesty, I didn't really know what it was. And it wasn't until I started really digging in to realize that I have Civil War ancestors. There's a lot of really good documentation and a lot of good resources about these soldiers online at the National Archives, various other places. We're going to talk about those things tonight. And we are going to talk about both of these and what they are. So some of you may recognize those. Some of you may be in the same situation I was, and you're not quite sure what that even is, but give it about an hour and you'll know all about it. So this right here, this is the National Archives. And like I said, this is Pennsylvania Avenue. So that my virtual background back there, now that you saw the background, I'm going to turn my video off now that you saw the virtual background, but those windows out there, that was Pennsylvania Avenue. That's this road right there. And it's a pretty big building. For context, you can see there's people standing right down there in the corner, probably taking their break, but it's a really big building. There's a lot of records there. Funny story, first time I ever went to the National Archives, I didn't realize it, but there's actually 2 sides to this building. This is the research side. The back side is probably where most people go. That's where the museum is, like the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, that's all on display right there. So the first time I ever went to Washington, D.C. to go to the archives, I got in line, and there was a really long line of people waiting to get in. And I got in line, and I just figured, well, the archives must be a really popular place. looked around and realized I was in line with a bunch of 14-year-olds. And I thought, well, that's kind of strange. I don't know many 14-year-olds that are that interested in doing research, till I realized I was in the wrong line. So I had to come back over here. So if you ever go to Washington, D.C. to do Civil War research or any kind of research, make sure you get in the right line or on the right side of the building, because otherwise you might be a chaperone on an 8th grade field trip and not even know it. So don't say I didn't warn you. So we're going to talk about Civil War records tonight. And one thing I want to tell you guys, the National Archives, if you go there to do Civil War research, for the most part, with the Civil War records, it's mostly Union Army records. There are exceptions to that. You can find Confederate service records at the National Archives, but actually they are all online at Fold 3 as well. So if you were to go to the National Archives specifically looking for Confederate service records, you kind of wasted your time, because you could probably do that either from the library or even sitting on your living room couch and view those same things. There are some Confederate company records there. We will talk about those, but those are all at the archives, but I believe those are all online as well. There are some, as far as Confederates, there's some like miscellaneous papers that did not get filed with the service records, and those are all there, but they're mostly on Fold 3 as well. If you go looking for Confederate pensions, they do exist, but they were at the individual state archives, not the National Archives. When the pension started becoming issued to the soldiers, the Confederate government was not about to fund pensions for the rebels. So they only funded it for the Union Army soldiers. The individual states decided they were going to fund those pensions for the Confederates. So when those files got closed out, since the state was funding it, it went to their state archives. So that's why the Union Army papers are at the National Archives, because it was funded by the federal government. Most anything of genealogical significance at the National Archives that is related to the Civil War is, for the most part, going to be related to Union soldiers. So what records are available at the National Archives? Well, that's a very broad question. If you're looking specifically for Civil War soldiers, we're going to talk about these 4 record groups right here. This page right here is basically the outline for the presentation. We're going to talk about these 4 records. Then I will go into some frequently asked questions that I get a lot. Then I'll do sort of a case study of how I used a Civil War pension file to help unlock one of my own family history, our mysteries. So those 4 records that we're going to look at are the pension records, the compiled military service records, the carded medical records, and the company's record of events. It's those 4 records that we're going to be spending a lot of time looking at during this presentation. So let's start out with Civil War pensions. This, I showed you an example of one of these at the very beginning when I said I didn't know quite what it was. This is what's called a pension index card. If you find one of these for your ancestor on Ancestry or Fold 3, Family Search, that means that there is a Civil War pension file at the National Archives for them. All the file numbers are there. So this is a pension index card. There are different types of pensions that soldiers could apply for. There were the 2 categories were the invalid, and no, that does not say invalid. I get people asking me sometimes why their ancestors' pension was invalid, and it wasn't. It was an invalid pension. These are pensions that the soldier himself would apply for. And then there was the widow or the minor. You know, once the soldier died, if he had young children, sometimes you'll see a father or a mother down here. That's what's called a dependent pension. If they left dependents behind, they sometimes were eligible to apply for pensions. So this is another one of my ancestors, my 3rd great grandfather, William Penn, and he applied for a pension on his behalf in 1891. After he died, his widow, Susan, applied for a pension in 1911. So this is a pension index card documenting all of that. This pension index card, I don't know who this is. I'm not related to this guy, but I would love to know what was going on here. There's all kinds of stuff going on here. Soldier Walter Wilson all kinds of names here listed as the dependents. He applied for a pension in 1928 as an invalid, based on an injury or some kind of sickness that he had. In 1930, shortly after, a widow applied, so he must have died shortly after he was approved. 1931, there was a minor that was applied for a pension. But back up to 1930, a month after this was filed, a month later, there was a contested widow. So somebody else came forward and said, no, I am the widow and I deserve that pension. In 1933, another contested widow showed up saying the same thing. So I would love to know what's going on here. This guy was all over the map. He fought in Virginia. He filed his pension while he was living in DC, and so did the first widow. The minor was from Wyoming, and so was the second widow, and then the third widow was from Georgia. So I don't know what was going on, but a lot was going on there. So what's in a military pension file? You know that quote from Forrest Gump? Mama said life is like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get. I talk about pensions in the same fashion, that you never know what you're going to get inside of a pension file. You'll find some of the basic stuff in just about every pension file, but sometimes you get this totally unexpected document or some kind of treasure that that you don't know, you don't even expect to be getting here. And I'll show you some of those. A typical military pension file, typically on average 75 to 100 pages long. So they could be pretty big documents. The shortest one I ever saw was only 2 pages. The widow applied for it and then never sent any supporting documents and just abandoned the whole thing. So the second page was just notification that the pension application was abandoned and dropped. The longest one I've ever seen is about 550 pages. And I'll talk about that one a little bit later on, tell you why it's so long. You can get all kinds of correspondence with the Pension Bureau. All the proof that they would submit to get their pension claim is going to be in there. This is a big statement down here, but I stand behind it, that these can be some of the most genealogically significant files that are out there for your Civil War ancestor. If you have a Civil War ancestor, you need to check to see if they have a pension, because you can learn all kinds of great stuff about them. This is the file that I will be giving away. I'll go to the National Archives and scan a pension file for your ancestor for free. This is the file that I'm talking about, is the pension file. So if you haven't entered that already, make sure you do that, because we'll do that at the end of the presentation. The reason these can be so significant is because the soldier or the widow would apply for the pension and make a claim, and the Pension Bureau would want some kind of proof of what they were saying. So if it was a widow applying and said, my husband was a soldier, he died in 1902, and he left me with 4 young children to support, so I want to apply for a pension. Well, the Pension Bureau would want proof that the soldier even served in the war. They would want proof that he died in 1902. They would want proof that they were married. They would want proof that they had 4 children, and they would want proof that they were all under the age of 16. So as you can imagine, that kind of documentation makes for a very good genealogical file. So it's not unusual to find medical records about the soldier. They were required to get checkups all throughout their life if they were getting this invalid pension. So you get all kinds of medical reports. Sometimes you learn more about your ancestor than you really wanted to know, but it's all in there. You can get vital records, birth, death, marriage records for the soldier's children, some things that he did during the war, even information about previous residences, previous marriages. For another one of my Civil War ancestors, he mentioned that he had been married previously, and I had no idea. I guess the first wife died when she was like 19, never showed up in a census record. So I didn't even know until I read the pension file. So this is an example of the kind of page that you might get in a Civil War pension file. And I know that's kind of small, and I'm sure some of you are scooting really close to the screen to try to read that. So I will enlarge part of it for you. This is a soldier named John Campbell. And this is a typical thing that you're going to find in most pensions. He's talking about the unit he was in. He was in the 14th Regiment of the Kentucky Cavalry. When he enlisted, even a physical description, 5 feet 9 inches tall, fair hair, light eyes. I'm sorry, complexion fair, light hair, gray eyes. So a really interesting physical description you can get about your ancestor. But then he goes on to explain why he thinks he's eligible to get an invalid pension. He's talking about how he was sleeping on the damp ground. He got some kind of like pneumonia or some kind of sickness from sleeping on the cold, damp ground during the war. So it's not going to break down any genealogical brick walls by learning this, but it's a really interesting insight into what your ancestor was doing during the war. You'll get affidavits from the physicians, the doctors that were checking him out. This is the declaration for the widow's pension. Anytime you see that word declaration in there, that's the application they filled out. This was the beginning of the process. So look what you get in the widow's pensions. This was a soldier named George Doane. The widow was applying that, saying that the soldier died May 14, 1889. That when she was married, her maiden name was Rebecca Moore. They were married May 26, 1874. There's the clergyman's name, where they were married. Previous marriage, he was previously married to Margaret Richardson. She died in 1873. Though that could break down a genealogical brick wall right in this pension file. And then she goes on to talk about the fact that she had young children left behind. And she gives the names and exact birth dates of all of the ones that were under 16 at the time. This guy's name was scratched out, white out. I don't think they had white out back then. I don't know how that disappeared, erased. I don't know, but I have a feeling this first one was probably over 16, so they had to take him off the list. It's not uncommon to find affidavits from various neighbors, friends, telling about the soldier's character. Maybe it was a fellow soldier saying, yeah, I was with him at the time. I know he served. I was there when he was injured. I spent time in the hospital with him. You get those kind of details in these records too. This is a soldier named Moses Delamarter that I had been researching a couple years ago for somebody. And I had been finding him all over the map, like quite literally. He was showing up in New York, and then I found him in Nebraska, then I found him in Oklahoma, I found him in Montana. I found him with different wives, different children. And Moses Delamarter is not that common of a name, so I was pretty sure he was the same guy, but I couldn't tell for sure until I got his Civil War pension file. He's talking here that he was born April 5th, 1836 in Boone County, New York, talking about other residences in his own words, his own writing. He lived in Charleston, Nebraska, which was in York County in 1872 to 1900, Elk City, Oklahoma from 1900 to 1907, Aledo, Oklahoma from 1907 to the present. He then moved to Montana where he died. So this confirmed where he was all those times that I really was tracking the right guy. But here's the thing. Moses Delamarter had 3 wives, and I think he had 7 sons. And they all, each of the 3 wives had children. So it was really hard to pinpoint which one belonged to which wife. But then Moses Delamarter fixed that problem for me. He gives the names and maiden names of all 3 of the wives, when they died, where they died, and then he goes on to talk about all 7 of his children, which all happen to be boys, first and middle names, exact birth dates, and which of the wives they belong to. So, and then he actually signed it down here. So how cool is that? So this saved me hours or not weeks of work. I had it right here in his own writing, firsthand information about his family. Oh, this one, I just ran across this one recently. I thought this was kind of funny. A letter that a gentleman wrote to the Pension Bureau talking about a soldier named Daniel Lepley. So apparently Daniel Lepley applied for the pension, and he felt it was his duty to tell the Pension Bureau that Daniel Lepley is really pulling your leg. He thinks it's his duty to inform you that he was never in the Army. He enlisted in the 43rd Ohio, but he deserted before the regiment ever got out of the county. He hid here in the caves and woods for 2 years. Then he was arrested and kept under guard for 3 months. When he made his way back, he was still hiding out. He almost starved to death instead of going off to the Army. He was a rebel in the full meaning of the word. So this is one of those bonus things that you can get in these pension files that can shed some new light on your ancestor. Now, I don't know how true this is. Maybe this guy was mad at Daniel Lepley. I don't know. But so he goes on to say, now there's another case or two in the vicinity that needs to be looked at. And I'll furnish information if you promise me secrecy. Goes on to say, given the scoop on some of the guys in the community and what was really going on and how they're trying to scam the pension bureau. He signed it here with his name, Hugh Green. I kind of want to look Hugh Green up and find his descendants and tell him that your ancestor was the town gossip. He knew the scoop on everybody. But the backside of the letter kind of made me laugh. P.S. If you write me, please send it in a non-official envelope. He didn't want anyone to know that he was communicating with the pension bureau. He wanted to remain in secret and give it the secret informant. So I was saying before that the pension bureau would want proof of all the claims they were making. So what you find in those is things like this. James Meyer was a soldier who was applying for a pension. The pension bureau needed to know how old he was. So he wrote to his brother and said, there's no record of my birth. Can you write to the pension bureau? Just tell them that you know when my birthday is and you know how old I am. Because the pension bureau would take these affidavits under consideration when there was no vital records. So he wrote to his oldest brother, typical firstborn, overachiever, that this is actually the second page. The first page, he was saying that I was born 1839, Ed was born April 1841, you were born April 9th, 1843, Lucinda was born March 6th, 1845, and goes on and on with the rest of the siblings. Alexander and Fillmore, I've lost them from my memory. I don't know what happened there. But then he goes on to say, father was born May 22nd, 1810 in Württemberg, Germany on the river Neckar, 8 or 9 miles from Stuttgart, if I remember correctly. Mother was born in November 1820. I've forgotten the day. Can you imagine if this was your family? You probably wouldn't even think to look in the Civil War pension file to get the immigration and birth records, not immigration, but the exact place where the family was from, when they were born, all detailed here in a letter. The brother went above and beyond, more information than he really needed, but we are now the beneficiaries of that because that's in his pension file now. This is a cool one. This was William Penn. I mentioned him at the beginning. He was my third great grandfather. This was a story about him being in the Battle of South Mountain in Maryland. And he had his war buddy, William Bradley, fill out an affidavit that he was there when he got injured, that they were climbing the mountain. They were climbing South Mountain. And William Penn got shot in the neck. And he tumbled down the mountain. And William Bradley had to go catch him, took him off the mountain and took him to a hospital, pretty much saved his life. This was a story that my family had no idea about. I asked my grandfather if he knew this about his great-grandfather. He had no idea. This was a story that would have been lost over time had it not been for this Civil War pension file. Okay, here's another one. Minerva Peoples giving information about her marriage. She was applying for a widow's pension on behalf of her husband who had died. But here's the thing, that Minerva Peoples was African American and she had been enslaved before the war. So if you've ever done African American genealogy, it can be difficult, not always impossible, but more difficult to track down some of these records about your ancestor before the war. But she goes on to say that before the war, I lived in and near Mount Pleasant, Maury County, Tennessee. When I was born, I belonged to Louis Lanier. At the time I was 18, 19 years old, he sold me to his daughter, Rebecca Coleman. So if you've ever done African-American research, especially ones that were enslaved, you know that one of the key things that you need to know is who do they belong to? And this gives details of who the slave owner was and when they were sold. They belonged to Rebecca Coleman till a few months before Buchanan was elected president, till I was made free. My fellow servants were Ellen Lawrence, who was my sister, and her children. So now you got family members named in here too. She also goes on to talk about how during the war, she left where she was enslaved. She remained in a contraband camp for one night and then went to work for Mrs. Jeans on the Hillsborough Pike. So you got a whole little family history there. Not all the details, but enough to give you a good start right there in her own words. But wait, because as impressive as that is, there's still more. Because sometimes these statements they were making, they weren't quite enough. And the Pension Bureau would say, okay, that's a really good story, but we need some kind of official proof that what you're saying is really true. We need proof that these children really are the age that you say they are, because they had to be 16 and under. We need proof that they're not really 17 or 18 and you're not trying to get extra money from us. We need some kind of proof that this guy that you say you were living with, that you really were married to him and not just living with him. Those kind of things. So put your genealogical thinking caps on. How would you prove if you were a Civil War widow and you were having children in the 1850s or 1860s, and you were in an area where either the vital records were destroyed or they were never kept to begin with, how could you communicate that to the Pension Bureau in a way that they would accept? How could you prove that? Because sometimes they would do the affidavits, but they weren't quite enough. I will show you some examples of what these people would do. This is a page from a family Bible that was sent in, giving the names and dates of birth dates and some of the death dates of the family. She was trying to prove that the children were the age that they say they were. This was right in the pension file. This is an interesting one. I don't know if you can read this very well. It's a little hard to read. I'm not sure if you know what you're looking at there. Right up here, dear father and mother. And it's dated, I believe, 1865, a little hard to read, from Camp Casey. This was a letter that was written home from a soldier to his mom and dad. And this is now part of the pension file. Now you may wonder, why is there a letter written home in a pension file? What's the purpose of that? Well, the thing is, this boy, I don't know if he was a boy or a young man, whatever, died during the war, and the mother was applying for a pension on his behalf. So in order to be eligible for the pension, you needed to prove that you really were mother and son, and you also needed to prove that you were getting support from that soldier, your son, before the war, during the war, and that you were financially dependent on him. And then the government would pick that up and then start giving you money instead of the soldier. So these letters were sent in. You see these a lot of times in mother's pensions. I find letters written home in there fairly often, actually, because he addressed it to father and mother. He signed his name to it. And so the Pension Bureau knew that, okay, you really are mother and son. But he also talks about how he was going to be sending money home. So that was enough proof, and they accepted it. The pension was approved because of this letter. Remember Minerva Peoples? She was the one that was enslaved during the war. She was married twice, and so she needed to submit proof of her first marriage in order to prove that her second marriage was valid. They needed proof that the first marriage began and ended, and that the second marriage was the soldier. So this is an example. She went back to the courthouse in Davidson County, Tennessee, and got a certified copy of the marriage record from 1866 to her first marriage there. So that was in the pension file as well. Now, this is a cool one too, and I'm showing you the pension card to set the story up. This was a soldier named Jared Benjamin, but he had an alias of Charles Sparks that he served in during the war. So keeping that in mind, knowing that he had two names, after he died, his widow was applying for a pension on his behalf. And the Pension Bureau got a little confused, understandably, to say, okay, you're calling him Jared Benjamin. We knew him as Charles Sparks. So that's quite a stretch, lady. How do we know that this was really the same person? And it would be difficult to prove because the soldier himself had already died, so he couldn't speak on his behalf. So I found another letter in there, and this was written to his cousin in 1865 during the war. But you know what they did? She submitted the letter, and she submitted this little like 2-inch by 3-inch love poem that he signed on the back to her. What they did, though, they would compare the handwriting between the letter written by Charles Sparks and this thing written by Jared Benjamin, and they said, okay, handwriting is close enough. We will believe you that he was the same guy. Kind of creative there, isn't it? But you know what's cool about that? Did you notice the date on there? April 16th, 1865 in Mobile, Alabama. Those of you who know your Civil War history, what happened 7 days earlier? On April 9th, 1865 was the day that Grant and Lee met and the surrender papers were signed. It was the beginning of the end of the Civil War, 7 days earlier. What happened April 14th, 2 days before this? Lincoln was shot. He hung on overnight and died the morning of the 15th. So this is a snapshot of that exact time period in history from a soldier's perspective in Mobile, Alabama, talking about how the people here in the South are anxious to take the oath. They had to take an oath of allegiance back to the Union to be re-entered back in as a citizen. So he's documenting that. But this is interesting. I hope all the rumors are true that we hear about Davis and Lee. If they are, the war is near its end, but they seem too good to be true. I'm afraid we will hope for the best. If they want to fight more, we're ready to fight them. I kind of want to tell them, hey, you know what, buddy? Just hang on because it's pretty much over. So you're done. But this letter is a cool little snapshot of that right there in that pension file. So if you're looking for a Civil War pension file in the index and you don't see them, there may be a reason why. Here's some reasons why your ancestor might not have gotten a pension. One could be he just didn't live long enough. If he came home healthy from the war, but died like, 5 years later from something totally unrelated to any injury during the war, there might not be any reason to apply for a pension. He might not just didn't live long enough. If he was single when he died, like if he outlived his wife, there may have been no one left behind to apply for a pension on his behalf. Or if his wife got remarried right after he died, she was no longer eligible for his pension. If he was a deserter, if he left on bad terms, if he deserted, if he was dishonorably discharged, all those kind of things, he wasn't going to get a pension. If he didn't serve 90 days, he most likely was not going to get approved for the pension. If your ancestor was maybe in one of those border states or even a southern state, and he was affiliated with the Confederacy and then later on joined up with the Union Army, which happened a lot, if they had proof that you were affiliated with the Confederacy at some point, they were not going to give you a pension. Not to say that you shouldn't check to see if your ancestor even applied, because some of them tried to get away with it, either through ignorance on their own part, or they were just trying to think, oh, maybe they won't notice. You still need to check it out. Even if you know that he was a deserter, check the pension index. You may still find an application. Might not have been approved, but you can still find the file where he tried to apply. All right, so those were the Civil War pension files. I spent a lot of time on those because I feel like those are some of the most interesting Civil War records out there. So the second record, we're not going to spend as much time on all of them. Second record, the compiled military service records. I just realized I put the wrong abbreviation there. That should be CMSR, not CSMR. But CMSR, or I just usually call them the service records because that's a lot to say. So these are those long rectangular cards that I mentioned at the very beginning that have to do with each individual soldier. These are available for Union and Confederate soldiers both. I mentioned at the beginning, the Confederate ones are all online at Fold 3. Some of the Union Army ones are online at Fold 3. A lot of them, you can only access them for now at the National Archives, though. So what's in a compiled military service record? Just as the name says, this was compiled from a lot of different sources there at the National Archives. They would look at things like the muster rolls, hospital records, prisoner of war records, payroll records, any kind of enlistments, anything that the soldier was doing that showed up on one of these ledgers, they would compile and write it onto a card and put it into a packet. The reason they were doing this, right around 1890, there was a law that was passed that allowed for a lot more soldiers to become eligible for pensions. So the Pension Bureau got this major influx of all these applications they had to approve. The pension clerks were having to go through, dig out these ledgers every time and verify that, okay, he really was taken prisoner of war for these dates. He really was in the hospital for a month for this sickness. It just got to be so much work digging out these ledgers every time. The pension approval process was getting way backed up. People were getting frustrated. So they decided to undertake this massive project in the 1890s where they were going through and writing out these cards. They went through the ledgers, and anytime they saw a hospital entry or a prisoner of war entry, they'd put it on a card and they would have a whole packet here. So these actually were done in the 1890s. They're referencing events from the 1860s, though. So if you are looking for a Navy sailor, they did not have service records. If your ancestor was in the regular Army, as opposed to like the Pennsylvania, like the state infantries, regular Army would be like the 21st U.S. Cavalry, has the U.S. in the name. If he was in the regular Army, he also will not have service records. Yeah, they detail things like promotions, injuries, stuff like that. So in the service records, for the most part, like the pensions, you can get a lot of genealogical information sometimes. With the service records, these are documenting more of the historical side of what he was doing, where he was during the war, if he was, like I said, promoted or anything like that. You can, from time to time, get some genealogy information in here. You're going to get how old he was when he enlisted, which could be helpful to narrow down, like if it's a common name soldier, look at how old he was and maybe even where he was born to narrow down, is this your ancestor or someone with the same name? Physical descriptions, what he did for a living, when he enlisted, any kind of miscellaneous papers that are related to him, you'll find in here. And I want to show you, we're going to talk about a soldier named James Doris. And I'm not going to go through the entire thing. I'll just hit some of the highlights. But I knew that James Doris was in Company A of the 21st Pennsylvania Cavalry. I knew he enlisted for a 6-month term. So I requested the service records for that particular term of service. This is what they brought me at the National Archives. This is an envelope, and all the papers are inside of here. Has his name. He went in as a private. When he was done, he left as a private. So if these two vary, you'll know that he either got a promotion or a demotion at the time. These numbers down here, they're just serial numbers of the cards. They're not terribly significant. But what you can learn from this is because there's 5 numbers here, there are going to be 5 of those long rectangular cards. So that's a bit of useful information to make sure you have the whole packet. Number of personal papers, 0. There was none of those miscellaneous papers, which it's always kind of cool to see what those miscellaneous papers are, but he didn't have any on his. So this page here, we can see he enlisted for 6 months when he was 20 years old. He enrolled in June from York County, Pennsylvania. Let's fast forward to September and October of 1863. His card is showing the muster rolls stated that he was absent when the muster roll was taken. The reason being that he was sick in York County, Pennsylvania. So he was either in the hospital, maybe he went back home. Not sure, it doesn't say, but he was sick and not with his unit. Let's fast forward again to February of 1864. His 6-month term had expired. He was discharged, but he re-enlisted for 3 years or to the war's end. That's by this point in the war, soldiers were doing that, saying, I'll do 3 years or when the war ends, whichever is longer. So he re-enlisted, and now I knew I needed to look for his second set of records. Again, he was in Company A, the 21st Pennsylvania Cavalry. They extended that 6-month regiment into a 2-year regiment. Into a 3-year enlistment regiment there. So I requested those records, and I can see there's 6 cards here. He went in as a private, he left as a corporal, so he got a promotion. And in this time, there are 3 of those personal papers in there, so we'll take a look at what those are as well. First card, he was born in York County, Pennsylvania. Now he's 21 years old. He had a birthday since then. Physical description, he had a $60 bounty due to him. So you might be surprised, soldiers actually got a bonus for signing up for the war. By this point in the war, midway through, a lot of those guys that were signing up just for patriotic duty, they had already signed up. So they were like, we need more people. So if you re-enlist or if you just enlist for the first time, we will pay you money to do that. And so he actually took advantage of that, got a $60 bounty for enlisting. And inside of that service record packet, one of the personal papers was his actual enlistment record. Tells about when he enlisted. He actually signed this paper. This is something that he would have held in his hands and signed the document himself. Fast forward a little bit, 3 days later, actually, 3 days after he enlisted, he was promoted to a corporal. So he must have been doing something right. They must have liked him and saw something in him, promoted him 1 rank up to a corporal 3 days after he re-enlisted. Unfortunately, you fast forward to June of 1864, it mentions that he was wounded in the trenches at Petersburg, Virginia, and he died the next day in July of 1864. So unfortunately, this young man re-enlisted and didn't survive much longer after his re-enlistment. But as unfortunate as it is that he died during the war, as genealogists or historians, we should be asking ourselves, what kind of documentation, what kind of paperwork may have been generated as a result of that? In this case, I don't see these very often, but I actually found one for him in the service record. One of those miscellaneous papers was a death certificate. And it mentions in here how he died, that a shell wound through the abdomen. So he was shot through the abdomen and he didn't survive that. This third miscellaneous personal paper, we had the enlistment paper, the death certificate, and then we had this. And I thought this would have been kind of cool to look at just to see, what did he have on him when he died? What was he carrying around? But unfortunately, it was left completely blank. I thought it would be a cool little, snapshot of what, just something about his life there during the war, but it was left completely blank. When I turned it over, though, I got this little piece of information. A little hard to read there, so I'll enlarge it. The deceased formerly resided in York County, Pennsylvania. His father, Robert Doris, lives in Lower Chancellor, York County, Pennsylvania. You don't get a lot of direct evidence of a father-son connection in these Civil War records. Soldiers were not required to give their parents' names, so a lot of times they're not in there at all. This is one of the times that you get some kind of direct evidence of who his father was. And I'm sure it was in there because they needed to know where to send his personal belongings to. So other records, you might find some other types of things in a service record, such as a prisoner of war record. The soldier John Clark was captured in Marks Mills, Arkansas in 1864, and it gives the end result. He was paroled in 1865 in February, so he served, about 9 months or so. He was at a prisoner of war camp, and this gives information about that. I found this in a service record, a request for a furlough home. William Butler, respectfully requests a leave of absence to go to New York for 15 days. The cause of my application is to fulfill an engagement made some time ago with a young lady. I'm an unmarried man. Now, it doesn't directly say what he's doing. I think he's going home to get married. That's what it sounds like to me. And these furlough papers, if you find them, can actually really be helpful, because if you find your ancestor getting married in the middle of the war, you may be like, I thought he was out fighting. How did he get married in the middle of all this? Or it may be that his wife is having a baby during the war, and you're thinking, again, something's going on because he was off at war. How did she get pregnant? But a furlough paper could explain where he was at the time and answer some of those questions. And I actually found one of those lists of what the soldier was carrying when he died. Another soldier who sadly died during the war, a young man named Sumner Leach. He was only 18 or 19 years old, but it details all the things that he was carrying: a knapsack, the blankets, gloves, and 3 postage stamps. And I'm sure they were carrying those because that was their only connection to home, to be able to write back and forth. Occasionally, you'll find these as well, hospital bed cards, and I happen to find one for another one of my ancestors, Augustus Miller. And if they were hospitalized, sometimes they would fill out these hospital bed cards. It would give information about why he was hospitalized with rubiola, But if you're looking for genealogical information, you may find it on here. Post office at address of wife or nearest relative. And it shows here his wife was E. Miller. So if you're looking for some kind of genealogical information, you may find it there. I'm sure this was there in case the soldier died. If the soldier ended up dying during the war, then it would they would know where to who to contact, kind of thing. So those were the service records. We talked about the pension, talked about the service records. Talk just briefly about these last two records. I'm only going to touch on them quickly. Carded medical records. These are really cool addition to your ancestor story. Similar to those service records, they looked at the hospital ledgers, and they every time there was an entry about a soldier who was sick entering the hospital, they would fill out one of these medical cards for them. So not every soldier is going to have them. I found maybe 30 to 40% soldiers have medical cards. So these were the original ledgers. Remember, I showed you Augustus Miller with the hospital bed card in there for Rubiola. This is that hospital entry in the ledger for Augustus Miller. He entered for Rubiola. These are the kind of ledgers that those pension clerks were having to dig up every time a soldier made a claim for his pension. So they made those carded medical records to make it much easier for them. So all they would have to do was look to see what kind of medical cards does Augustus Miller have. So they are now in boxes like this at the archives. So I requested this box, looked through, found Augustus Miller, and there he is, diagnosis Rubiola. This is the carded medical record from that hospital ledger I just showed you. While he was there, they filled out that hospital bed card that you saw a minute ago too. He was in there more than once too. His next entry, his chief complaint was that he was sick. Thanks, that's really detailed. That tells me a lot. But you can get details. This is a different soldier. He was wounded through like a shell, like ammunition. He was shot. This man here, Anson Fisher, he was wounded, a mortal wound through the chest. So you get information about when and where he died and why he died. You can find those in these carded medical records. The fourth record is the company's record of events. And these, you know what, I should have told you. The carded medical records, let's go back real quick. These are available for Confederates and Union Army as well. Confederates, I believe they're included in their service record packet. With the Union Army, they are a whole separate record group they have to request separately. So these do exist for both sides. Same with these company records, they are available for both sides. These rarely are going to mention a specific soldier by name. These are more related to where his company was during the war and what they were doing. So if you want to track your ancestors' company month by month, where were they? Were they engaged in a specific battle? Sometimes it's mentioned in there, not always, but sometimes. If you can compare these to the service records to know that your ancestor was, like my William Penn that I mentioned, I knew he was in the war because of the service records. I know that he was in there in January of 1863. I know from the record of events that his company was in Gettysburg at that time. So I know that my ancestor may have been involved in the Battle of Gettysburg. And I say may because I don't know if maybe he was hospitalized that day. Maybe he got a furlough when he went home. But you can compare those two records and match up maybe where your ancestor was. Here's an example. This is more detail than you're normally going to get. I picked this one on purpose just because there was a lot of information there. Company C of the 97th Pennsylvania Infantry. In May of June of 1862, they were in James Island, South Carolina. You can see what was going on. Company C was one of the 5 companies engaged in the repulse of the rebel advances. They lost 3 men, 7 wounded. On June 16th, another skirmish with the rebels. Only 1 man was taken. The member of the band was taken prisoner. Poor guy was out of the whole company. Only this one guy was captured and taken prisoner. So those are the 4 main record groups that I look at when I want to get a complete picture of an ancestor's Civil War service: the pension, the service record, medical cards, and these company records. So some frequently asked questions that I get a lot. One of them being, and maybe you get this a lot too, aren't these all online? I feel like inevitably if I'm scrolling through like a place like Facebook or something, and someone posts in a genealogy group that I have this Civil War record, Civil War ancestor, what can I do? How do I get more information? I feel like inevitably someone will always say, go to Fold 3 and you'll find it there. Hopefully, you know that the answer to that question is no, they are not all online. There's about Union Army records alone, there's about 2 million Civil War pension files at the National Archives. There are some widows' pensions on Fold 3. There are some, but it only represents between 5 and 10% of these pensions that are all the pensions that exist. And that does not even include the invalid pensions. So there is an enormous amount of these pension files that are not online. Some, I think most all of the Union Navy pensions are online at Fold 3. Some of the Confederate pensions are online. They were done from the state archives, and you can go to the state archive pages and get information about that. Some of them are on Family Search. Some of the Union service records are going to be on Fold 3, but not all. All of the Confederate service records are on Fold 3. I mentioned that before. This is right in the handout. So if you end up downloading the handout, you'll have a record of this list here. It talks about the pension numbers that are online and how they're not all online. The first 148,100 widows' pensions are, but the rest of them are not. The service records for the Union Army, these are the states that have their service records online, along with all of the U.S. colored troops. Good rule of thumb here would be these tend to be the smaller sending states, meaning a state like Indiana, Ohio, New York that sent a lot of soldiers, they have not digitized their service records. But states like California, Colorado, the Dakota Territory, Texas, Utah, they did not really send a whole lot of soldiers to the war. So their records are not going to be, they are on Fold 3. Here's some links, and this again is right from the handout. So download that handout and you can get this information about tracking down some Confederate pensions. Another question I get all the time from people, and I don't blame people for asking because I would love to have a picture of my Civil War soldier all dressed up in his uniform. And I get this question a lot. And are there photos of the soldiers there? I'm going to say yes, but it's very rare. So I can't say no because you will find occasionally, rarely, you'll find a photo of him there, but it's pretty rare. You know that movie, Charlie, or Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, where Veruca Salt really wants that golden ticket. So she has her dad buy all those candy bars and they open all of them and finally find one. That's what I talk about with the pensions and finding a photo. If you open up enough pension files, you will eventually find a photo, but it's very rare. It's kind of like finding that golden ticket. The reason for that, there is no record group out there that has soldiers' photos in them. They were not required to do it, have their photos taken. The government didn't do it. There are photos of soldiers out there, but I always say it was on their own time and on their own dime. They would pay for it themselves and did it on their own time. It wasn't government sponsored. Some of those photos that the soldiers took, they do exist, but they're in like family collections, or I go to Civil War shows and I see them. You might even find them like on the Ancestry trees. If one exists, someone may have uploaded it on there so you can check there. The reason you may find a photo in the packet, as rare as it is, usually is because they were doing some sort of investigation. Now, remember at the very beginning of this talk, I talked about the pension file, the biggest one I ever saw, that was 550 pages long. Getting ahead of myself here. Oh, the photo's not showing up. Oh, well, there's supposed to be a photo here of a man. PowerPoint lost it somehow. Okay, well, just pretend there's a photo there. There's a photo of a soldier. He was actually an African-American man that was submitted, part of his pension file. He was applying for a Civil War pension based on his service. Pension Bureau, the government, kind of giving him a hard time, said, we don't believe you were actually in the war. You need to prove it. So he was getting affidavits from all of his fellow soldiers, all of his war buddies. They still weren't believing it. So they actually took a picture of him. It was a photo of him later in life. He looked like he was about 50 or so. And they took a photo of him and tracked down his fellow soldiers and said, do you recognize this man? He claims he was in the war with you. And eventually they did approve his pension because they took the photo around and everyone agreed that, yeah, I served with him. He really was in the war. So that's why his photo was there. And I just found this one recently, kind of a weird looking photo. It was one of those tintype photos. You may wonder, why is that guy sitting there? The older man sitting there with his leg crossed, his leg showing. Well, he wasn't just showing off his leg. I mean, he kind of was, but for a reason. He was claiming that he had an injury to his leg. And again, the Pension Bureau was not believing it. So they wanted a picture of his legs to see how injured are you. So he had this photo included in his pension file. And honestly, I don't see much wrong with his leg, but apparently it supported his claim because he got approved. We talked about this one a couple of minutes ago. Do these pension files, do they tell the parents' names? If you were paying attention, you know the answer that yes, it can, but again, it's not extremely common. And I mentioned this earlier, they were not required to give their parents' names when they signed up at any point. None of their paperwork, for the most part, none of their paperwork required a parent's name. From time to time, you may find something like that, though. You might find an affidavit in the pension file that maybe could have been from a parent. You may find like a death certificate, like I found for that other guy. If your soldier was underage when he enlisted, the enlistment form, technically the parent was supposed to sign off on, for the Union Army at least. They didn't always do it, but from time to time, you'll find a parent signing off on an enlistment form. And again, if the mother or father was applying for a pension on the soldier's behalf after he died during the war, obviously it's going to give information about the mother or father because that's what the pension is all about. So you may find it, but sometimes it's going to take a little more work. And this is the case study that I want to show you about. What you're more likely to find in these pension files, you may not find the direct evidence that says my father's name was, John Smith. You're not likely to find that. But if you read the whole file and you pay attention, you may get some new clues. You may find like his birthplace, and now maybe you can go look in that exact town to see what other kind of records might be there. Did he live in a previous residence you know about? Did one of his siblings sign off on some of these affidavits? These are all clues that you can further your genealogy research with. Elizabeth Shown Mills talks about the fan club, family and friends. I never know if that's family or friends it stands for. Associates and neighbors, the fan club. If you get stuck and you're out of ideas to research your actual ancestors' direct records there, start looking to see, who did he associate with? Maybe there's someone in his pension file that signed an affidavit talking about he was a fellow soldier. Well, go look in that soldier's file to see if your ancestor gave information. Maybe there's information in some of the vital records. Maybe one of these people that you're seeing in the pension file turns out to be a cousin that you didn't know about. Those kind of things. So you can get indirect evidence sometimes that can give you new clues about your research. So here is, I want you to think of an answer here. I'm going to tell you this is the question we're looking at. John Timms talks about, this is the pension file for John Timms, my great-great-grandfather. He had an affidavit signed by George Sutton. So he's testifying that in June of 1895, he's testifying that I've been well acquainted with John Timms for 21 years, and I see him about once a week. So anytime you see something like that, like this guy knew my ancestor for a long time and saw him on a regular basis. So who was this guy? So the question we're going to look at was, who was George Sutton? And why would he know John Sutton or John Tim so well and see him so often? So put your genealogical thinking caps on again. Come up with some kind of idea in your head. It's not listed on this file. I'll tell you too, it's not listed anywhere in the pension file who he really was, but we're going to figure it out. So at this point, it's only a guess. You really have very little to go on. So if you have a guess and you're wrong, don't feel too bad, because part of doing genealogy research is coming up with these theories of, who could this person be and how can I prove it or disprove it? So hopefully you have some kind of idea in your head of who George Sutton may have been. So let's look at another document here, another document from that pension file. This was Mary Timms in 1904, saying, I've been acquainted with John Timms, the claimant, for 30 years. Okay, so who was she? She's known him for a long time. Well, because they were married in April of 1874. So that's an obvious one, but this on its surface may seem like a really great standalone document that tells you the name and the date of his wife. Okay, great. But they're actually, in the transcribed sections that I showed you between this one and the one before, there actually is a connection. There's a clue in here that I didn't see at first that connects these two documents. Do you know what that might be? Just for reference, here's the first one. In June of 1895, he's known her for 21 years, see him about once a week. In 1904, she's saying, I was married in 1874. Well, here's the connection that I put together. Remember this, George Sutton said, I've known John Timms for 21 years. That's a very exact number. My guess is that if you have a friend that you've known from like the 90s that you used to work together or something, and I would ask you guys, oh, when did you guys meet? You might know the exact date, you might know the exact year, but I would guess, like if it was me, I'd probably say, I don't know, 20, 25 years ago. I don't know, it's been a while. You have to really think about, when did we meet? Well, he knows it was exactly 21 years. So he's referencing an exact date. What's 21 years before 1895? It is 1874, the same year that John and Mary got married. Big year for John Timms. He got married and he met George Sutton. So that's a clue. It's not an answer, but that could be a clue. And you might want to revise your theory now who George Sutton may have been. Or maybe you think you're on the right track still. So let's look at another piece of information from that pension file. Before we go on, Mary gave her age as 51 in this document. So this will be useful later that she was born about 1853. I didn't want to forget about that. So another piece of information. Here's a marriage license from the pension file from 1874 showing that John Timms and Mary Sutton were married. So that name should sound familiar. George Sutton and John Timms married Mary Sutton in Summit County, Ohio. So you may need to revise your theory again, or you may be thinking you're definitely on the right track now. So let's continue on. Knowing that Mary was born about 1853, like I showed down here, and she was married in Summit County, Ohio. Her maiden name was Mary Sutton. We have a middle initial here too, because a name like Mary Sutton could be fairly common, but I have a middle initial as well. So let's look, I'm going to go away from the pension file and look in a census record, looking for Mary A. Sutton, born 1853, living in Summit County, Ohio. See if anything comes up. And sure enough, this is what I come up with. Mary Ann Sutton, 17 years old in 1870, would be 1853, living in Summit County, Ohio. And you notice who is listed right below Mary. There's her brother, George. So who was George Sutton? He was John's brother-in-law and Mary's brother. So I started this little case study by the frequently asked question of, can you learn a parent's name through this file? Well, sometimes you can by getting this indirect evidence. In this case, I didn't get John's parents' names, but I ended up getting Mary's maiden name, her brother's name, and I ended up being able to find them in the census, which gave me her parents' names. They were from England, learned all kinds of new stuff because of those clues in that pension file. And a lot of times, finding maiden names for women can be harder than finding the parents for the men, not always. So I count this as a win either way. So in review, the 4 main record groups that you can get: pension record, compiled military service record, carded medical records, and the company's records. If you get all 4 of those, you've got a good picture of your ancestor service. So here's the question: how can you get these records? You can go to Washington, D.C. in person at the National Archives and view them. If you feel like traveling all the way down there, if you're local, go for it, but it could be quite a journey if you don't live locally. You can order them directly from the National Archives. You can go to archives.gov and they've got an order form you can fill out. You can pay them directly. You can hire a researcher to go for you. Allison told me that I could put a little plug in for myself. So I will say that I am one of those researchers that can go to the National Archives for you and get all these records. You can order directly from the archives. Feel free to do that. But if you want information about how to do that, feel free to contact me and I can get you set up. My rates are much cheaper than the archives ordering directly. So if you have any questions, let me know. You feel free to go to my website, civilwarrecords.com. I have a feature on there that if you're really not sure what to order, if you know you have the Civil War ancestor, but you're like, I don't really know if you had a pension, I don't know if this stuff's online. I threw a lot at you just now. So if it didn't all stick, there's a feature on my website, free feature. You can go to what tab that says what's available for my ancestor. It will type in what you know about your ancestor and submit it to me, and I can check the indexes for you and let you know what might be there and give you like a quote of how much it might cost you to order them. So
Awesome. Thank you so much, Brian. Do you want to go ahead and turn on your camera?
sure.
Okay, we'll leave this slide up for a minute so people can write that down.
Yeah.
Although the flyer has the website, you can get a hold of him through that as well. So make sure that you get the flyer, get the handout, get all that information. And then if you want a copy of the chat, please email us. We cannot just email everybody. So if you need the handout, the flyer, the chat, email us. Please don't put your email addresses in the chat. Email us at genealogy@acpl.info. Genealogy@acpl.info. Okay, Brian, there's 35 questions. We are not going to get through them.
Here we go. All right.
We're not going to get through them all. So in order to just, because of time, and let's do a few.
Okay.
If we do not get to your question, folks, please email. Brian has been so generous. He's given his contact information. You can email us as well, genealogy@acpl.info. My colleagues will keep putting that in the chat. We want you to be successful. We want to help you. Let's kind of start going through here. So you had mentioned this a little bit earlier, but somebody wondered if your company also does 1812 pension files.
I'm sorry, say that again.
1812 pension files?
What about them? Are you asking, is a question?
Do you pull them?
Yes, I will. Yes, I'll tell you, I do a whole seminar that's coming up in a month about 1812 records. So good little segue there. Come back in a month, watch for that, tell you all about it. A quick 30-second summary. I can do War of 1812 pensions, but they're digitizing a lot of those. A through like the middle of R and the middle of S are all on fold3.com, and they are free of charge to look at, even if you don't have a paid membership. But if you're looking for an 1812 pension and it's the end of the alphabet, contact me and I can help you with that. But there's a lot of other records for 1812 soldiers beyond pensions. So you can ask me about those like through my website and I'll hook you up with those too.
Awesome. So you guys heard it here first. Brian's coming back next month. So be sure to watch our calendar. Somebody's wondering if it's unusual for a Civil War veteran to not apply for a pension.
Yeah, I would say because it was free money, if they were eligible, I would say it was unusual. It's not unheard of. Maybe they felt like they have a really well-paying job and they don't need it. Maybe they didn't trust the government, things like that. But yeah, I would say is unusual, but not unheard of. But then you also have the ones that just weren't eligible. Maybe they deserted. Maybe they were, in the Confederacy at some point. So those are the reasons too. But just of their own free will, yeah, I would say that was more unusual.
Someone's wondering if they should get all the pension files for everyone in the regiment with the same surname.
I mean, you could, but are you just wondering if they were all family? You know what? I would tell you if you are trying to figure out if they're all family, here's what I'll tell you to do. You can do your theory, your method of getting all the pensions, but that's probably going to cost you a lot of money. What you might do is check out their service records first, because you may be able to find out where they were born, where they enlisted, how old they were, and you may be able to match it up with like the people that you know of. Sure, you can order all the pension files for that surname, but if it's like a Wilson, have fun with that. But
We're just going to do one more. If we didn't get to your question, please, please, please send an email. We want you to be successful. So this question is kind of multi-part. As much researching of Civil War records I have pulled, I still don't understand the C or XC numbers. What do they mean? How do I know in
okay,
advance if they're in DC or St. Louis?
okay, good question. Tell you what, I'm going to go back to the share screen just to show you something real quick, just to give you guys some reference context for what this question is about. Do you see down here it says XC and then a number? Not every pension file has an XC number. These were done. The Pension Bureau had a lot going on, like during the 1890s and stuff. As soldiers started dying out, like in the 1920s, there wasn't the need for an entire government branch of the Pension Bureau because there really wasn't a whole lot of pensioners still around. There were some, but the ones that were still around, like in mid 1920s, they sent them all, those active files, over to the Veterans Administration, Veterans Affairs. When the VA got them, they renumbered them. And that's what happened here. The VA got this one, stopped numbering them like with this stuff, started numbering it with them. So what that means is some of those pensions, when the pensioner died out, the file got closed. Sometimes the VA would send those pensions to DC, to the National Archives. Sometimes they would send them to St. Louis, to their branch of the archives. And it's kind of hit and miss, I would say maybe 50-50 as far as how many of those XC pensions are going to be in DC versus St. Louis. But I always say start with DC first, request it there. If it's not there, they'll tell you to check St. Louis. So
Sounds good. Thank you. All right. Well, thank you so much, Brian. And thank you, everybody, for joining us and asking your questions. I'm sorry we didn't get through all of them. But guys, please follow up with emails. We all want you to be successful. And thank you, Brian. That was absolutely wonderful. Everybody has been just very, very enthusiastic. And hopefully we'll see everybody at your War of 1812 presentation in
come
November.
back in a month. We'll talk about all about 1812 soldiers and their records. So
wonderful. Well, thank you so much. And I hope everybody has a good rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.